Hello. Check. 1, 2, 3, check. Check. 1, 2, 3, check. My name is Don Benitez, and I've been going live almost every day since September 2nd of this year. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Reflect says, Yo Don, what's up? Hello, Reflect. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Reflect says, bro, I've seen some improvements in your live streams. You're getting a lot of views, lol. Yeah, like a week ago I was getting like 200 views a stream, now it's in the thousands. Roman King says, you're a madman, bro. Laughing emoji, I love it. Thank you. Lost Man in His Dream says, Wolverine Alive? Yeah. Literally Anything says, say bit ol 3 times loudly. No. PE says, braiding my armpit hair. Okay. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Gregory Goonman says hello. Hello, Gregory. Tell or ask me anything at all in the chat. Lost Man in His Dream says spell run 3 times. No. Gregory Goonman says, it makes me smile to see you again, bro. Okay. Captain Caveman says, say no 3 different ways if you can. No. 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 TZ says, how old is your oldest Minecraft world you still play on? Like 2 weeks. Anonomy Mouse says, say hypothetically speaking. There you go. Robert says, hi man. Hello, Robert. Gregory Goonman says, okay, enough with this normal stuff. I must say some insane stuff. Okay. Robert says, remember me? No. Union Ash says, do your parents know you're gay? No. Sid says, AI. I'm not AI. Anon Mouse says, thank you, Ben Shapiro. Okay. Hale says, you look like Brock Lesnar. Okay. Black Rose says, you got a haircut? No. Gregory says, bro admitted to being gay. I don't think I did. Chris says, bro, why are your eyes so far apart? Genetics. Lizzie says, we are forsaken. Okay. Miku says, welcome back. Thank you. RJ says, you look angry. Everything okay? Yes. Shock Mountain says, I'm a bust, a wet fart. Okay. Selena says, how high on the spectrum are you? I don't think I'm on the spectrum. Random Pipe Layer says, bro, smile. Later, I will. Carter says, love God, love yourself. Okay. Drew says, shout out from Wheat, Virginia. Okay. Grady says, wine bag. Okay. Black Rose says, I love how you're reading this. I'm a sub. Okay. RJ says, you look like you want to just punch someone. I don't. Chris says, you look like that type of guy that would butt fuck your own dad. and not even give him a reach around? Is that a Full Metal Jacket quote? Carter says, God is king. Okay. Miku says, banana boiled egg. Okay. Robert says, play Crab Rave. No. Hale says, are you sick? Okay. I'm not sick. Bradley says, hi, what's the time there? It's nighttime. Shock Mountain says, Humpty Dumpty. Okay. Paul Phillips says, meow here. I'm not gonna meow. Chris says, do you eat corn the long way? No. Vic Lyon says, what is a blumpkin? I'm not gonna say. I wish I didn't know. Piss Flap says, pull my finger. No. Jacqueline says, love the smile. Thank you. Tricky says, what happened to your last live stream? My phone died. PE says, peanut butter and onion sandwich. No. Shamalish says, do you ever sleep? Yes. Bradley says, where in the USA are you from? Not gonna say. Glenn says, rusty trombone. Okay. Shock Mountain says, my Halloween pumpkin looks more human. Okay. Olivia says, what is your day job? I'm gonna keep that private. Cody Higgs says, I just woke up and thought I cooked sausage, but they were actually hamburger patties. Crazy. Joe Schmo says, Mamma Mia, Papa Pia, baby got the diarrhea. Okay. W420 says, Jesus is king and he loves you. I hope you have him in your heart. I don't. Tricky says, how tall are you? I'm 5'7". Josephine says, hi. Hello, Josephine. Gregory says, you look like you suck off crackheads. Okay. Hale says, you look like Dahmer. No, I don't. Zare says, hi. Hello, Zare. Olivia and Jay says, do you play video games? Sometimes. Shock Mountain says, how many ounces of Coke you got? 0. Dustin says, NPC. I'm an NPC. Okay. Robert says, it's 12:41 a.m. That's the time for you. Okay. Munch says, what is your channel about? Only this, me reading chat. Gerald says, do you collect Pokemon? No. Shock Mountain says, a blue shirt guy. Okay. Tricky says, it's 10:15. Okay. Gregory says, you look like if James Charles had Down syndrome. Okay. Justin says, what's your social security number? That's private information. RJ says, Subaru WRX. You like? No. Watchdog says, your favorite subreddit? 2B2T uncensored. Zare says, it's Zare. Okay. Anonymous says, what's your mother's maiden name? Not gonna say. Chip Tree says, do you work in IT? I don't. Beans says, hi. Hello, Beans. Miku says, banana. Okay. RJ says, thoughts on Naruto? Not a fan. Frost says, bro, I got a leg cramp and in both my legs at the same time. Sorry. Glenn says, do you have feelings? Yes. Chicken Little says, you ever change shirts? Yes. Skylar says, 420. Okay. Justin says, what's your email and password? Private information. Aylin says, you look like AI. Okay. Canyon says, don't forget the water. I think I'm hydrated right now. Kevin says, your favorite anal position? No comment. X Special says, are you depressed? No. Miku says, you look like a person. Okay. Watchdog says, you remember me, Don? I don't. Dustin says, are you diagnosed with a condition? Probably. JK says, Donnie boy, do you want to make out wet sloppy style? No. Jimmy Brown says, Jesus died for you. Okay. Gregory says, closeted gay man. Yep. RJ says, Elvis, was he good? Sure. Cam Carm says you're gay. Okay. Jeb says hi. Hello, Jeb. Dottie says hi, Don. Hello, Dottie. Joey says hi. Hello, Joey. Lilibro says, can you shout out my channel? No. Miku says, do you remember me from last stream? I remember your name. Maniac says, hi, I'm your sister watching. Please do the dishes. Don't take it seriously. Okay. Camcarm says, suck my toes. No. Jeb says, do you know me? Yeah, I do. AKA Caroline says hi. Hello, Caroline. Doro says, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you. Mira says hi. Hello, Mira. Little Gamer says smile. No. Underslash says hi. Hello, Underslash. Jacqueline says, my pet finds your voice very relaxing. Thank you. Kevin says, kiss, kiss. Okay. Captain Caveman says, put your eyelids inside out. I don't know how you do that. Shapeshifting says, you purposely skipping me, Don. I'm gonna KMS. I'm not. Cop says, hola, gringo. Hello, cop. Shock Mountain says, did you fart? No. Kevin says, do you celebrate Christmas? Yes. Watchdog says, have you ever willingly watched gay porn? No. Doro says, make a Batman voice? No, sorry. Taylor says, hello from Scotland. Hello, Taylor. AKA Caroline says, how was your day so far? Good, thank you, Caroline. Glenn says, do you use hair gel? Yes. Munch says, the new one? What? Mira says, why are you not blinking? Am I seriously forgetting to do that? I hope I'm blinking. Stomp says, you said 1 hour. It was more than that. I'm sorry. Phoenix says, you kind of remind me of the Gemini killer. I've gotten that. Love You Too says, why you look like you want to wipe out humanity, bro? I don't. Underslash says, I had a nosebleed today. Sorry. PE says, Joker beatbox? No. Caroline says, you have a pretty smile. Thank you. Jeb says, I'm back. Welcome back, Jeb. Don says, do you have kids? I do not. Munch says, hi, Jeb. You're saying hi to Jeb? Okay. Jeb says 6'7". Okay. Phoenix says, no disrespect. You seem cool. Okay. Icy King says, may the force be with you. Thank you. Dog says, how many times have you pooped your pants as an adult? 0. The Will to Win says, bro, you need to stop reading comments. You have read comments more than 12 hours. It's more entertaining than watching slop on YouTube. Mira says, did you stay up last night because your eyes are red? I think it's because I might just be staring at a screen too long and not blinking. Mr. Hand says, you are still doing this? Crying emoji. Yes. Doro says, I'm Superman. Okay. Justin says, you have tasty blood. Okay. Shock says, when you slit them, was it vertical or horizontal? What? Caroline says favorite YouTube channel, Sal C1. Ahmed says where are you from, North America. Jeb says 6'7", okay. RJ says thoughts on Diddy, don't like him. Gregory says you look like you give head to sharks, okay. Deadshot says why and how are you so nonchalant, I don't know. Kevin says I like backdoor action, okay. Icy King says you should be in the next Star Wars movie, I'm good. Chiptree says to be 2T, too tune to me to be too teased, okay. Cheese and Cheese says I love you, okay. Anakin says do you eat ass, no. Dark says are you a psychopath, no. Gluttan says say my fucking name, there you go. Shapeshifting says Don, your smile is so truthful, never stop smiling, I am developing an obsession, okay. Grady says there's a booger hanging from your right nostril, dude, I hope not. GI says Nick Fuentes for president, I'm not voting for him. Jeb says laughing emoji, okay. Watchdog says what's the thing spinning above your head, ceiling fan. Cat says were you shocked, you look grounded. Is that a Kaya reference? Glutton says Nick Fuentes for president indeed. You want to vote for Fuentes? Okay. Dixon says okay, thumbs up emoji, okay emoji, okay. Dark Reclaimer says have you ever played Devil May Cry? I haven't. Glenn says are you Mexican? No. It's Gabriel says what's up Ken? You're saying hi to Ken in the chat? Okay. RJ says Ron Weasley, closeted gay? I don't know. Cop says 25 Finland into house. What? Randy says Romans 3:23-24. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Okay. Zaxi says you look like AI. Okay. Justin says have you ever nutted? No comment. Smoothie says you like water? Yes. Omega says Chile for president. Vote for Chile de Castro. Okay. GV says never gonna give you up. Okay. SL says Don Demand. Thank you. Mira says do you know why there are different blood types? So mosquitoes can enjoy different flavors. Okay. Gluttan says we are all going to hell, bro. Act accordingly. Does that mean I should sin like crazy? Steven says I have AI in my deleted. What? Tricky says is 30 old? I'm 3 years away. You're 27 years old? Okay. Doro says please vote President Donald Trump. Okay. Fenna says why don't I see some of the comments you're reading? It's I have you have to turn top chat into live chat, if you understand that. Tricky says that was a question. Yeah, I guess you are old. Mash says hi, I'm new here. Hello, Mash. Chiptree says I'll be your idol, keeping you in check, keeping you obsessed, play me on repeat. Okay. Glutton says means everyone get off the high horse. What? Dixon says if my Uncle Jack got on an elephant, would you help Jack off the elephant? Are you trying to get me to say Jack off the elephant? Okay. Michael says I was just wondering what? Stomp says if your nose starts bleeding, will you just keep reading or will you stop? I think I would stop, but it would be kind of cool to keep on reading with the nosebleed. Scralla says, you won't believe it, but I can run like the wind blows. Okay. Chad Mack says, what's good, my boy? Keep up the great work. I will. Tricky says, I'm 27. You're in your 20s. Okay. Eliza says, greetings, Law. Hello, Eliza. Not the way says, show us your belly button. Hell no. Chip Tree says, okay. Maria says, hi. Hello, Maria. Glenn says, what age are you? And I'm an adult. Dixon says, I heard that one the other day. Okay. Icarus says, hello, comrade. Hello, Icarus. Gabriel says, I know you like femboys. I just can't prove it yet. Okay. Zippy says, I love cartel members. You shouldn't. Richie says, what you high on? No comment. Jay Espinoza says, para iteromicro. What? Zer says, hi. Hello, Zer. Brody says, Simon says, don't say Brody said this. What? Tricky says, Don is 30. Maybe. Jacqueline says, how do you not crack up at some of these comments? I'm desensitized. Shapeshifting says, Benitez 316. Okay. Dag says, don't get snippy at me. No promises. Art with personality says, you're back. Yes. Glutton says, I figured that. Okay. Joe Miller says, sounds like most of your viewers are dumb. Okay. Glenn says, can you speak Spanish? No. Pedro says, are you the Terminator? No. Stomp says, didn't you say your age in a previous live? Nope. Zippy says, do I not have a girlfriend because I play Clash Royale? That's not the reason. Multi says, the end times already happened. Interesting. Chiptree says, knock knock, who's there? Knock knock, who's there? Knock knock, who's there? Okay. Shock Mountain says, gay porn. Okay. Dag says, dang. Okay. Maria says, what the fuck, neighbor? Bet you 6 dicks hour now, are you? Are you talking about how long I've been streaming? Yeah, I've been streaming a while. Tricky says, he rated himself a 1. I did. King David says, EBT. Okay. Sharp says, B emoji. Okay. Blink says, did you know cheddar cheese is called cheddar because of where it is made? Cheddar, England. Okay. Glutton says, dyslexic. Okay. Moog says, if 2 universes collided within a multiverse bubble scenario, what measurable signature would that leave in our CMB? I don't know. Mitchie says, okay. This is not me says, what am I watching? Chaos. Zippy says, consequently. Okay. Odell says, say oil 20 times. No. Watchdog says, your favorite oil company? I'm not sure. Little says, how are you today? Good. King David says, the autistic streamer. Okay. Eleonora says, rap god at 1 million times. Game over. What? Goat says, do you like penguins? Yeah, emperor penguins are cool. Glenn says, do you like cocaine? No. Richie says, is there someone in that room? I saw a shadow. There is nobody in the room. Cat says, a coconut. Okay. Dark Reclaimer says, do you believe in any religion? No. Zippy says, do you mog? That's for you to answer. Watchdog says, will you ever show us your setup? No, it's kind of like Asmongold's, to be honest. Art with Personality says, are you homophobic? No. Zara says, what are you going to be for Halloween? Nothing. It's Gabriel says, are you jorking it right now? I'm not masturbating. Hollow says, why are your eyes dilated? I don't know. Ahmed says, what's your degree? No comment. Das Quist says, what version of autism are you wearing? I don't know. Glutton says, he looks like he lives in a sandcastle. Yeah, from that angle, kind of. That angle. Chitta says, I like your eyes, thank you. S says, lol, you chose to not read my shit. I don't ignore anyone in particular. James Johnson says, hi. Hello, James. Stomp says, are you scared of spiders? Somewhat. Shapeshifting says, is it normal to hurt people? No. Minnesota says, hello. Hello, Minnesota. Moog Modular says, if you could get $5 million, but had to forget every one of your favorite and happiest memories, would you take it? No. Khaled says, this guy high as fuck. No. Jaguar says, how long have you been doing this exactly? Well, this stream in particular, like half an hour. Dixon says, alien emoji, alien emoji. Okay. Sly says, anyone told you you look like Randy Orton? No. Cheetah says, do you think life is meaningless? Kind of. Kartik says, what's your ethnicity? Hispanic, Latino. Watchdog says, why do you hide your age? I'm just paranoid, but I totally see myself in the future being like way more open and saying like the city I live in. Poop says tweaker. I'm a tweaker. Okay. Jeb says I'm back. Welcome back, Jeb. Cart says, can you smile, please? No. Shapeshifting Sweetheart says, thoughts on deportation? No comment. Chiptree says, what's your favorite kind of food? The Big Mac. Richie says, I hate Trump so much. Okay. Stomp says, hold on, are you wearing contacts? Yes. Fulvio says, are you always this chilled and relaxed? Yes. Jesus is God says, you religious? No. Matt says, bet you beat your dog? No, I'm not, like Hassan. Richie says, MAGA are traitors? Okay. Biggie says, name one thing that will improve your life, but you're not doing it. Eating healthily. Called says, the Big Mac is maybe the worst thing in the world. I understand your perspective. Blake says, I want to make you my prison princess. Okay. Dixon says, are you stoned right now? Maybe. Minnesota says, this guy's an icon. Okay. Raj says, are you Asian? No. Raxley says, would you like to be immortal? No. It's Gabriel says, goon, goon, goon. When someone tells you not to, just goon and forget about everything. Quote Abraham Lincoln. He did not say that. Stomp says, are they colored contacts or just augmented? They're for my vision. That's it. Dixon says maybe means yes. I guess it does. Benny says you look like my son. Okay. Art with personality says rate yourself 1 to 10. 5. Precision says say free Palestine. I guess there you go. Mad Max says say Mike Roch. You wanted me to say my crotch. Okay. William says tell everyone what I'm thinking. You're thinking about water bottles. No, Pookie says more lights, please. You want the lights back on? Maybe I'll do that. Ben says stop touching kids. I don't touch kids sexually. Raxley says, were you born in the US? Maybe. Khaled says, you were gonna say he was thinking something nasty. Yeah, I mean, maybe this chat is doing bad things to my brain. Erica says, laughing out loud. Okay. William says, close, it was balloons. Okay. Captain One says, Donling's Discord server win. I don't see the point in that. It's Gabriel says, he laughed, guys. Okay. Leaf Dude says, tell me what 15 times 9 is. 130, I don't know. Eli says, I eat bananas the long way. Okay, that's normal. No Pookie says, I have this son, one button. Okay. Shock Mountain says, are you related to Anne Frank? I don't think so. Shapeshifting says, want some X, Don? What? Cart says, how to conquer goon addiction? I don't know. Glutton says, chinchilla, chinchilla, chinchilla. Okay. Trust in Jesus says, Nick Fuentes is a neo-nationalist socialist party. Okay. Will says, don't touch my no-no places. I don't plan to. Richie says, why are you doing this? For fun. Chiptree says, ha 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 ha. Okay. PE says, pass. Okay. Stomp says, can you guess what my favorite thing to breathe is? Air. Watchdog says, your opinion on Russia? No comment. Shapeshifting says, do you have plans for the future? Yes. Chiptree says, OMG laughed. Funny. Art with Personality says, 34 plus 33, 67. Glenn says, you like hash browns? Yes. No Pookie says, stop digging in your butt, twin. Ooh woo. Okay. It's Gabriel says, I'm stroking it right now, sideways, my dick, horizontal and vertical. Okay. Raj says, are you into fasting? Thinking emoji. I'm not. Dark Reclaimer says, are you smoking that sugar-coated Canadian blueberry apple pie? No. Crushtrum says, have you ever written a story? Yes. Doss says, keep bro, keep it up. This is cinema. Thank you. Peter Koopa says, is it a sin to bleach your anus? Probably. Art with Personality says, I'm dying. Okay. Shapeshifting says, I'm not real, Don. This is not real. We still love you. Okay. Mary says, I'm playing Fortnite, y'all. Okay. Nisco says, what's that tweaking over the cycling? What? Precision says, opinion on India. Trains. Watchdog says, do you like marriage? Yes. Chiptree says, oh my god, I'm wheezing in real life. What the fuck? Nice. Glutton says, laughing out loud. Okay. Blank says, did you know that a group of squids are referred to as a squad? Cool. Kimberly says, where do you keep your crack? No comment. Stomp says, I'm not seeing It's Gabriel's comments at all. Are you just making them up? I'm not making them up. Cart says, trains, bro, get a life. There's like 1,000 things you should have said. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Joe Quinn says, live. Yes, this is live. Motivational says, yo, it's my autistic friend. Hello. Captain says, I'm not seeing Gabriel's comments either. Okay. Malik says, how is fentanyl? I haven't tried it. Raj says, you vegan? No. Trevo says, no triggers. Okay. Dag says, I see it's Gabriel just fine. Okay. Shapeshifting says, smelling the screen so hard, the SIM card pulled out. Good musk, Don. You're smelling the screen? Okay. No Pookie says, did you know dolphins like humping people? Is that real? Joe Quinn says, just reading comments. Is this what you've been doing for the entire stream? Yes. Glutton says, someone put antidepressants in my ice cream just before stream. Okay. Richie says, what's your favorite drug? No comment. Captain One says, Gabriel is speaking to Don telepathically. Okay. Jesus says, have you slept yet? Yes. Taylor says, what has 6 wings and an arrow? I don't know. Iana says, I'm back. Welcome back, Iana. Khalid says, Jesus looking out for you, bro. Okay. SG says, Holocaust or 9/11. What? Precision says, do you watch soccer or football? No. The Observer says, boo. That's not funny. Shock says, how many dicks does a camel have? 1. Raj says, how is your facial skin so good? Thinking emoji. I don't know. It's Gabriel says, do you watch adult movies that are 18 plus? No. Shapeshifting says, I love that you're opening up. So hot. I'm so wet. Okay. Shock Mountain says, no for what? Khaled says, you didn't have to do the thinking emoji, bro. Yeah, maybe I'll stop that. Little Cheesy says, whip it out. No. Damien says, hello, I exist. You do. Munch says, had a phone call, what I miss. I forgot already. Stomp says, shape-shifting what? Laughing emoji. Okay. Gavin says, are you a bum boy? What? Shape-shifting says, never hide our soul. What? Your other dad says, what is smegma? I don't know, but because of it, something was cut on my body. Lurk says, what's the time there now? Nighttime. Kevin says, have you ever tried your own semen? Hell no. It's Gabriel says, has it ever happened to you that a dog laid on your chest and you felt its balls on your chest? No. C optional says, I want my foreskin back. Okay. Crestrum says, what is your story called? I don't remember. I mean, of course I've written stories in my life, but I don't really remember. One of them I think was called The American Monk. Nisco says, are you maidenless? Yes. The Observer says, why is this chat so freaky? It's what happens when you let people be anonymous online. Amy says, ha, okay. Chitta says, do you want to get a tattoo? No. Damien says, my favorite team is Los Angeles Lakers. Okay. Yuna says, please. Please what? Stomp says, OMG, he's cut. Okay. Iana says, am I cool as a friend? I mean, you're cool as a chatter in my live stream. Evan says, where do you hide the bodies? I don't bury people. MJ says, hi Don, I'm back for the 3rd day. Welcome back. Precision says, are you American? Maybe. No Pookie says, throwing up emoji. Okay. Glutton says you made it awkward. Okay. Shock Mountain says a camel has 4 dicks. I don't believe that. Zeddington says I'm back. Welcome back, Zeddington. MJ says chirky emoji, hand emoji. Okay. It's Gabriel says, have you seen Two Girls, One Cup? No, and I don't plan to. X Rock says, what's your ethnicity? Hispanic, Latino. Watchdog says he doesn't have a dick. The ops got him bad. Okay. Cheetah said, do you hate us? No. Black Rose says, this guy needs a hug. Okay. Shock Mountain says, no, 1 dick, 4 tits. Okay. Majestic says, this chat is why forced birth control needs to be implemented immediately. Okay. Shapeshifting says, you lost me, Don. I only do uncut hunks. Okay. Cart says, ass or boobs guy, no preference. Anthrax says, using only the top row of your keyboard, the longest word you can type is typewriter. If that's true, that's cool. Crestrum says, there's literally like 10 stories called American Monk. Okay. Watchdog says, do you ever take the stuff this chat says personally? I don't think so. C Optional says, Majestic Traveler is a porn-brained drug addict. Okay. It's Gabriel says, Don, you ever had lumbago before? No, but I know Uncle has. Precision says, what is your opinion on Pakistan? No comment. X Rock says, reads comment? Okay. Okay. Benny says, if you are 21 or over, you are my son. Okay. Glutton says, you have no sense of humor. Who sang that? What? Kevin says, congratulations on your fam, my friend. Thank you. Amy says, laughing emoji. Okay. Shapeshifting says, I'm hitting myself now. So much pain. You should stop. Jessica says, are you gay? No. The Observer says, a kid typing you're gay. It's so dumb since it's spelled you're gay, but you clearly aren't. This chat is just unwell mentally. Okay. May says, what's your favorite brain rot? W speed, if that's a brain rot. Marcus says, Jesus loves you, brother. Thank you, but I don't believe in Jesus. Sharp says, Rolling Stones or the Beatles. The Beatles. Beagle says, do you have cats or dogs? Which do you prefer? Dogs. Shapeshifting says, I need money for the psychiatrist. Help me out, Don. Sorry, I'm not. X-Rock says, what's your favorite kind of music? Good music. Jail Pro says, I'm 8. Okay. You should leave if you're 8. JT says, you want to see my pecker? No. Kevin says, Don, I would definitely blow you. I would decline. Jessica says, do you support Palestine? No comment. Shapeshifting says, oh, my wiener is big. Okay. Air Stomp says, it's rock. You said rock before? Okay. The Observer says, you look like Edward Scissorhands. Okay. Nisco says, who is your favorite black person? I don't know. Diz says, this dude is fascinating to me. What's with him? Okay. Jessica says, do you goon? No. Chiptree says, self-affirmations. I am joyful. I am peaceful. I am awesome. Okay. It's Gabriel says, Don, I'll allow you to stuff it in me deep. I don't want to. Shannon says, who is your favorite white person? I don't know. Precision says, what is your belief? I'm not religious. Cap or Die says, Don, are you a suburban dude? Maybe. Jail says, do you like fries? Not to the point where I buy them. Nisco says, did you die in COVID-19 era? No, I'm still alive. Yash says, why are you angry? I'm not. Philomosity says, hello, Don Benitez. Do you remember me? How are your eyes feeling? I remember you, and my eyes feel good. Kevin says, if you had to be gay, would it be with a white or black guy? I don't know. W. Beagle says, you sound British. Okay. Watchdog says, are you an atheist? I guess so. Glutton says he can't, laughing out loud. What? It's Gabriel says, Dawn, is it pink? I don't have a vagina. Stomp says, have you always been this way, even as a child? No. Tis what it is says, he does not sound British, laughing out loud. Okay. Anita says, hola, papacito. Okay. MJ says, go drink some water. Soon. Thanks for the reminder. Glenn says, have you farted today? I don't want to think about it. Joseph says, okay emoji. Okay. Jose says, poppy. Okay. Al says, have you ever said the N-word? No. Gabriel says, do you drink or smoke? No comment. Cart says, Giga Chad, Easter Island statue emoji. Okay. Rhombus says, do you like Wendy's? Yeah, but I prefer McDonald's or Burger King. Shannon says, weed. Maybe. Chiptree says, Dawn, have you watched K-pop Demon Hunters? Isn't that on Netflix? I haven't watched it. Al Stringer says, what's your favorite game? Red Dead Redemption 1. Vintage says, you prefer McDonald's over Wendy's? Yes. Tribo says, lean? No. Peter says, do you like Bob Dylan? Thumbs up emoji. No, but maybe if I gave him a chance, I would. Siren says, what color is your Bugatti? I don't have one. X-Rock says, you sound like those neutral aliens from Futurama. Okay. Cap says, Don, you look like you used to play soccer. A soccer dude? Only a little bit, tiny bit. Shapeshifting says, I need sleep, Don. Thank you for all you have given me. This is it. Bye, Shapeshifting. Good night. Raphael says, I love meth. Okay. Hunter says, why are you so angry? I'm not angry. C optional says, Don, why do you think people of a specific race smell so horrible? No comment. Psychopath says, that's a frog in it. In your profile picture, it looks like it. Watchdog says, you said the N-word, we remember, Don? What? Vintage says, people say anything online? Yes. Cap or Die says, you just earned a like, bud. Keep this up, and I'm subscribing. I don't care. Faded says, wow, you smile. Yeah, sometimes. Diskit says, much love, bro. Okay. Joseph says, TikTok laughing emoji. What? MJ says, do you hate the way British people say movie, flick, or film? No, I don't mind. Minnesota says, icon. Okay. Divine says, Elliot Rogers. No, he's dead. Hunter S says, you're seethingly angry. I'm not. Nisco says, do you think supophobia is the reason? I don't know what that is. Ball Striker says, many are brave behind a keyboard. No consequences. You're talking about keyboard warriors? Okay. Cart says, skibbity W speed. A bunch of a stupid emojis. Okay. Jose says, bro looks like he would beat you up for an egg sandwich. I wouldn't do that. Jail says, hi, thanks for replying to my comment. Don't feel special. Oli says, it's 4:20 a.m. Go to sleep. Soon. It's Gabriel says, Dawn, if you ignore me one more time, I'm gonna leak your IP address. Well, I paid attention to you there, so don't do it. Vintage says, Dawn, what kind of karate do you do? None. Shock says, are you roast beef or bubblegum? Neither. Jay says, wait, what the fuck? I wake up for work at 4. Go to sleep. The Observer says, who won the race between the skeleton or the skull? The skull, 'cause he had a head start. Okay. Munch says, favorite horror movie, The Shining. Raphael says, you are weak. Okay. Glutton says, in it. Okay. MJ says, I know about the flies. The files, Don. The Epstein files. Leak them then. Joe says, okay. Okay. Jay says, what is this channel about? Just this, reading comments. Siren says, do you like watching anime? Not particularly. Gary says, do you have roots from a different country than the US? Maybe. Cart says, you hurt me? I don't think I did. Vintage says, this is a social experiment. Yeah, this is, kind of. Peter says, are you in a wheelchair? I'm not. Zeddington says, yo, you still remember me? No. Benny says, my neighbors are possessed by demons. Sorry to hear that. Ilumi says, hi Don, can you kill me? No. Glutton says, shut your cock-sucking mouth. No. Vintage says, a wheelchair, laughing aloud. Okay. Cart says, I'm going from here, bro. Goodbye, Cart. Norma says, I threw a baby down the stairs. That's horrible. Glenn says, do you get intrusive thoughts? Yes. Big Homestyle says, this is brilliant. Thanks. Jose says, I'ma call MS-13 on you. Please don't do that. I don't want to get decapitated. Zeddington says, bro, I'm the spammer. Yeah, I remember you spamming. Nisco says, I died to Radon 362 times. Okay. Lily says, do you like crime? No. Chip Tree says, Don, do you use gel, hair clay, fiber cream? C Optional says, Don, can you rotate an apple in your head? What? Jamie says, are you okay? Yes, I am. Shannon says, like a Time X taking a licking. What? W420 says, please tell me you given Jesus a chance. I read the Bible occasionally, but I don't believe in Jesus. Rocky says, why am I here? Laughing emoji. I don't know why. Ilumi says, I remember you. You're the guy that sold me Fent. That wasn't me. Watchdog says, your favorite art? The Garden of Earthly Delights. Jailpro says, please don't stop recording. Okay. Glutton says, it's getting hot in here, innit? Okay. Miesa says, would you rather eat 200 lemons or wrestle your best friend's mom? I don't want to think about that. C optional says, Don, why do indie people of a certain race eat cow manure? I had no comment. Gabriel says, Don, say goodnight. What the fuck? Good night, Gabriel. Jacqueline says, what's one thing on your bucket list? I don't know. Joseph says, do you like God? No. Xrox says, what would you do if you were locked in a room? Talk to the lock because communication is key. Funny. Legend says, drink water. Thanks for the reminder. Ilumi says, do or will you eat ass? Never. Psychopath says, hop out my bed, turn my swag on. Okay. Vintage says, everyone saw it. Saw what? Christoph says, hi. Hello, Christoph. Glutton says, say, pfft. Okay. Jailpro says, I'm eating chips right now. Okay. Norma says, say mango mustard. 67 chicken stars. What? Psychopath says, do you wear a bra? No. Jose says, I'ma call the Crips on you. Don't do that. Rocky says, do you make money from the stream? Not yet. Gary says, have you ever visited a Mafrankalistic experimental room for science? I haven't. Jose says, I love your hair. Thank you. Sandra says, nice teeth smile. Thanks. Kevin says, what's your favorite porn website? I don't have one. Chanda says, hi. Hello, Chanda. Watchdog says, average Dawn chat. Gay, God, sex, brain rot, random questions. Yes. Devi says, about to fall asleep to this in a soothing way, not boring. Nice. Jailpro says, I like space a lot. Okay. Joseph says, do you have a YouTube play button? No. Cap or Die says, Dawn, will you adopt me? No. Ilumi says, ever vaped in the shower? No. Psychopath says, are you a silly little boy? No. Arctic says, you're on to something, brah. Okay. Big Home Style says, do you believe we landed on the moon? Yes, I believe mainstream media. Norma says, today, do you want to learn about the Bible? I already have, but I don't believe in Jesus. Ulysses says, thoughts on Nick Fuentes? I don't agree with him at all, but I don't hate him. Lily says, was that sarcasm? What? Quark says, first male lesbian? Okay. It's Gabriel says, I told you, Don, if you ignore me, then this will happen. I paid attention to you there. Anita says, what's worse than two lesbians running with scissors? Two lesbians scissoring with the runs? Okay. Eric M says, create the vortex? No. Alumi says, thoughts on Operation Desert Storm? It looks like a good game. I haven't played it. Jose says, I bet it's Batty Hub. Okay. The Ken Man says, if you read the book of Enoch, you will believe in Jesus. I haven't read it. Maybe I will in the future. Jamie says, would you rather go into the past or future? The future. Kevin says, do you believe in Yaqub, the guy with the big head that created white people? No. Glenn says, are you a gamer? Somewhat. Munch says, you know how to make holy water? You boil the hell out of it. Funny. Cap or Die says, Don, I would like to borrow you, my wife, for a week. What? Psychopath says, when will you return the slab? What slab? Kevin says, when I seen you fall, my first thoughts of you and your family, that you should not have survived. What? Kevin says, can 5-year-old Indonesian children enter Agartha? Agartha isn't real. Christian says, Jesus is king. Okay. Jail Pro says, are you 20 years old? Maybe. 16 says, why are you always on early morning? It's because of my sleep schedule. Lily says, if you had to kill an entire nation to save your family? Alright, no comment. Glutton says, yeah, sure. Okay. Kevin says, do you wear socks? Yes. Vintage says, Don is smart. Okay. The Ken Man says, it's 10:35 p.m. here. Okay. Cheetah says, do you use sunscreen? I don't, but maybe I should. Kian says, okay. Kevin says, why did you smile while saying kill? 'Cause jarring things are funny, unfortunately. Easy Does It says, you don't wear socks, bro. Quit lying. I do. Chiptree says, are you caught up with 2B2T lore? Somewhat. I've watched lots of FitMC videos and SalC1 videos, but they're all so forgettable, to be honest. Glutton says, Yeshua of Yeshuas. Okay. It's Gabriel says, Don, are you secretly a lizard? No. Cap or Die says, Don, are you aura farming? I think it's working. Not intentionally. Kevin says, shave your eyebrows for $2. No, bad deal. AJ says, do you think Atlas 31 is a comet or spaceship? Comet. Jesus Christ is Lord says, Don, do you have a favorite knife and plastic wrap? Is that a CSGO thing? I don't know about it. It's Gabriel says, Don, can I make you pregnant? No, that's impossible. Vintage says, it's a spaceship. Okay. Psychopath says, gay Skeletor controls my thoughts. Okay. Kevin says, Don Benitez says, ask me anything. Indeed. Jamie says, would you rather be armless or legless? Legless. Ghost Samurai says, it's not a comet. Comet. Okay. Lily says, you have big eyes. Okay. Jose says, Vintage says, Don is a baddie. Okay. You guys are breaking the system. Tejo says, what would you do if ICE knocks on your door? Show my ID. Kevin says, do you dream of Legolas the elf. I don't know what that is. Lummy says Angela White or Lisa Ann. Neither. Kevin says, show me your canines. No. Eric says, do you see a therapist? No comment. Etet says, uwu. Okay. Gary says, do not redeem the virus, Don Benitez. Okay. Kevin says, eat something for $4. No. Diego says, do you know Spanish? No. Abraham says, what's your favorite thing? Family members. Jail Pro says, I have 2 brothers. Okay. Kevin says, please blink. Thanks for the reminder. Raphael says, you look like the protagonist from Fahrenheit Indigo Prophecy. Okay. Psychopath says, are you scared of one of your uncles like I am? No. Lily says, opinion on incest. It's gross. Jose says, Kevin says, what? Okay. Chiptree says, have you watched Ish's civilization videos? Is that like a Minecraft thing? I haven't. Peter Cooper says, have you dreamt about fighting a gorilla naked? Never. EJ says, I'm pooping right now, just like Trump, in my pants. Okay. Bill says, rent your forehead space. I'm not gonna tattoo a company name on my forehead. Jose says, that's disgusting, bro. Okay. Captain Insane says, you like Skyrim? I haven't played it. Jail Pro says, have you watched the Minecraft movie? Yes, in theaters. Brody says, I can't work out what to do when coming down from stimulants either. Try streaming like me. Captain Insane says, get on THT. What? Kevin says, Don, have you seen Citizen Kane? Yes, I have seen Citizen Kane. Watchdog says, what was your favorite cartoon from your childhood? Avatar: The Last Airbender. The Ken Man says, David says hi, and he says what she says, but can't say what you says. Okay. Wayne says, what's the difference between a hippo and a zippo? What? Fading Star says, remember me. I remember your name. Scream says, Jesus is the Alpha and Omega. Okay. Mayan says, I am Steve. Okay. Kevin says, can we recreate the hospital scene from the end of Evangelion? I haven't seen that show. Dazman says, you game? Yes. Yellow says, ever had dinner? Yes. Chiptree says, who do you like? Aang, Sokka, Katara, Toph, Zuko, Azula. Jose says, Don says, stop spamming Jose. You're breaking the system. Yes. Legend says, good morning. I don't know if you remember me. Yeah, I remember you because I remember your name. Yellow says, male butthole or female butthole? No comment. Glutton says, baking or breaking? Breaking. Jose says, Don, have you seen The Wire? No, I heard it was good though. Wayne says, what does a gynecologist and a pizza delivery guy have in common? What? Alumni says, are blondes or brunettes easier to stalk? What? Ashfac says, are you dog? I'm not a dog. Wayne says, they both can smell it but not eat it. Okay. Lily says, One Punch Man, like or no like? I haven't watched it. Shapressa says, hi from Albania. Welcome back. EK says, skin of a killer Bella. What? The Tifosia says, all the time you have to leave a space. What are you guys saying? Dazman says, get Arc Raiders, it just came out. I'm not into video games too much anymore. Scream says, Genesis 2:16, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest free eat. Okay. Shapressa says, I'm back from school. Hope you had a good day at school. Leon says, just sharing good vibes, brother. Thanks. That Ninja says, ever do Fent? No. Munch says, I'm number 2. Yeah, you've got a number 2 next to your name. I don't know what that means. Ilumi says, what's your star sign? Not gonna say. Jose says, Don says, 63 dash pound sign dash money sign. Okay. Best of luck says, shut up. No. Vintage says, another good answer. Okay. Psychopath says, ooh woo, I made a stinky poopy in my diaper. Okay. Christopher says, when was your gender assignment procedure? It hasn't happened yet. That Ninja says, imagine bro at a ghetto warehouse job. What? Glutton says, rednecks don't like creeps. Okay. Ashfac says, what do you do for a living? No comment. Wayne says, have you seen The Substance? Is that a movie? I haven't seen it. Scream says, Revelation 1:2. Who bear record of the word of God and of the testimony of Jesus Christ and of all things that he saw? Okay. Best of luck says, shut up. I said no. Hale says, do you like Marvel? Sure. I Build Robots says, what up, Don? Have a good day. Hello, I Build Robots. I haven't seen you in a while. Daisy says, I woke up at 10, lol. Okay. Wayne says, there is no convincing evidence of any gods. I agree with you. Hale says, are you Christian? No. Vintage says, best of luck is a hoe. Okay. Legend says, meatballs are nice. Okay. Undisclosed says, what's your thoughts on AI? Inevitable. Cap or Die says, no means finish the sentence. No means no. The Ken Man says, I'm going to watch Gangs of New York. Okay, I heard it was a good movie. James says, are you a bot? No. Glutton says, spam. Okay. Steve says, good morning, twin. I'm about to go let the chickens out. Cool. Ghost Samurai says, Gangs of New York is an excellent movie. Okay. Shiptree says, Don, I think the rankings basically mean you've been here long enough and commented long enough to earn XP. Yeah, it's something like that. Maga Pepe says, what is the best deodorant to send to India? Ones you can buy in bulk. Dazman says, is your mom a MILF? What? The Kinman says, if everything in the Bible is real, does that prove God is real? I guess so. Lily says, monsters versus aliens. Do you know the movie? Yeah, I've seen it. AP3 says, God is always restoring his glory. Okay. Glutton says, boys into hood is for gays. Okay. Hawktua says, do you evade taxes? No. Munch says, I love spam fritters. Okay. Elumi says, big booty bit that shit on Elefonso. Okay. Jacqueline says, you're very handsome. Thanks. Chiptree says, spam for XP. That's crazy if that's how it works. Dasman says, Menace to Society is a gangsta movie. Okay. Shannon says, are you a pedo? No. Grunky says, go to sleep, bro. Not yet. That Ninja says, laughing my ass off. Okay. Too Crazy says, would you rather watch a tree grow or a neighbor? What? Ashfaq says, brush your teeth, kiddo. I did. Prod says, bro, don't sleep. Okay. Hale says, pork or beef? Beef. Legend says, when's bedtime? Not saying. I Love Nora says, good night, chat. Have an amazing sleep. Thanks. That Ninja says, take a dump yet? No. Shapressa says, I'm wearing the Milan shirt with Kaka's name. What? Vintage says, Dawn is personification of ChatGPT. I'm not smart. Ghost Samurai says, big booty freckle faced bells. Okay. Sharp says, I'm back from watching a girl sleep. Creepy. Elumi says, have you heard of the movie The Warriors? No. Glutton says, Ghost Samurai. Okay. Hawktua says, Ta Guapo, translate it. I don't want to. Dasman says, Warriors come out and play. Okay. Jose says, Hawktua said you're handsome. I hope so. Chiptree says, wait, why is my ranking going down? I don't know. Arctic says, Don Benitez, would you rather eat a baby goat or a matter, daddy? What? Jose says, by the way, drink water. Thanks for the reminder. Vintage says, daddy. Okay. Chiptree says, no. Okay. Munch says, darn it. Okay. Elumi says, ever smacked a fat line? No. Dasman says, you'd sacrifice a goat in a ritual? No. Psychopath says, good night, little man. Mommy will be back tomorrow. Bye, Cycle. Lily says, Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones? I can't remember watching either of them. I think I've watched Lord of the Rings, but I can't remember watching it. Luke Wright says, are you interested in recording studios? No. Hale says, do you know Elva Dor? No. Mello says, Bachlet, Bip, Bookies? Okay. Jail Pro says, I'm so stressed. Okay. Shapressa says, God of War or Call of Duty? Call of Duty. Maga Pepe says, would you rather go to hell if heaven was an eternal gay pride show? What? South says he's definitely an atheist. I think so. Elemi says, are you Shark Boy from Shark Boy and Lava Girl? No. The Ken Man says, I'm off to watch the movie, so peace. Bye, Ken Man. Shapressa says, Call of Duty. Okay. Kevin says, try gaming. Video games bore me nowadays. C optional says, Don, should we turn Palestine or India into glass? No. Rose says, who wins, Goku or Brain Rot? Brain Rot. Munch says, recommend a good chair. Herman Miller chairs. Vintage says, video games are pretty gay now. Okay. Cheese says, what makes you most happy? Family members. Jamie says, what movie or book universe would you rather be stuck in? I don't know, a universe where things prosper. Shapressa says, bro, drink water, you deserve it. Thank you for the reminder. Rousey says, are you an alien? I'm not. That Ninja says, Fent makes me happy. Okay. Ghost Samurai says, you know Jesus is faked, right? Okay. Self says, bro definitely takes a good pegging. Okay. Shapressa says, I'm worried about you. Don't worry. Cap says, Don, do you have faith in today's society? Yes and no. A. Frank says, are you a groper? Am I one of Fuente's gropers? No. Spamano says, Lincoln Park lives in Texas. Okay. Lily says, Jesus isn't fake. There's historical records of him. Okay. The Tifosia says, the Tofissa says, okay. Dale says, why do I always get the weirdos when I take a shit? I don't know. Cap or Die says, did Elon construct you? He didn't. Orange Clown says, you like Coke or no sugar Coke? I like Coke with sugar. Elemi says, what's the name of your new channel? It's, I really only care about this channel right now. Lily H says, Nick Fuentes dated a catboy. Yeah, I do remember he went like on a date or something with a catboy. Rigby says, bro, why don't you read my comments? I don't ignore you in particular. Vintage says, Dale has mud butt. Okay. Chess says, what is your biggest goal? I don't know. Mystic says, do you play video games? Only Minecraft. Deathbringer says, I subscribed. Okay. Hawktua says, Johnson. Translate it, please, you'll like. No. Hisa says, hi. Hello, Hisa. Munch says, how long have you been live? This stream, like an hour and a half. Rosie says, you look so tired. Get some sleep. I will. Luke Wright says, I'm back, bud. Welcome back, Luke Wright. Stealth says, Dale is my favorite OF creator. Okay. I Build Robots says, PC, Xbox, or PS5? PC. Cap or Die says, Don, I'm thinking about subscribing. Where do I send the invoice, bud? What? Rose says, yep, ignoring me. Sad emoji. Sorry. That ninja says, if creators show poopy butts. What? Muncha says, laughing emoji. Okay. Not Anberry says, my boy's back. Hello, Anberry. South says, Dale is outside right now. Okay. EJ says, Barbie or G.I. Joe. Barbie. Chip Tree says, would you firebend or bend in other ways? Firebend. Zombie says, can you speak Espanol? No. Alumi says, are you the guy Daniel Larson touched? I've never met Daniel Larson. Union Ash says, if you are reading this, it's already too late. Late for what? Rocket Champ says, are you from USA? I live in North America. South says, ban Legend because he's spamming. Maybe I'll ban spammers in the future, but for now, I don't want to ban anyone. Deathbringer says, I lost some of my hearing. Sorry to hear that. Munch says, I would prefer to bend water. Okay. Jamie says, what's your favorite decade of music? 2000s. That Rolling Stoner says, can you tell a joke? Sorry, no. Ghost Samurai says, I've never seen a miracle of Jesus, but I have walked into a hospital. Okay. A messenger says, Christ is king. Okay. Snobber says, can you smile? No. Seed Tester says, the Gemini killer is back at it again. Okay. Cap or Die says, Don, do you cook? Did you cook? What? Hawktua says, are you a K-pop idol? No. Munch says, yeah, he smiles, winky face. Okay. Deathbringer says, how have you been? Good, thank you. Hisa says, I'm having bad thoughts. I'm sorry to hear that, Hisa. Vinchid says, nobody likes K-pop. Lots of people like K-pop. Rosie says, 6'7". Okay. South says, dude, Don, have you ever had sexual experiences with a man? No. Hisa says, I love K-pop. All right. A messenger says, Jesus is real and he loves you. Thank you. Luke Wright says, I'm 6'8" at 15. Cool. Hawktua says, are you Jeffrey Dahmer? No. That Roland Stoner says, K-pop is crap. Okay. Cap or Die says, that question almost made Don malfunction. Laughing my ass off. Okay. Rosie says, A-E-A-E-A-E. Okay. EJ says, if a vagina is a taco and a penis is a burrito, is a taquito a pencil dick? A pencil dick? I don't know. Brad says, what is your ethnic background out of curiosity? Latino. Rose says, tell yo dad that kid. What? Mr. Godzilla says, make Majunga Saurus a party hat. What? Camaro says, are you the guy Cyrax touched? I don't know who Cyrax is. Munch says, his name is Don Benitez. Okay. Jordan says, your eyes are too far apart. Okay. Usurpant says, you ignored my question, poophead. Sorry. South says, Don, can you start reading chats in Spanish? I don't know Spanish. Maga says, can you say a quick prayer for my erectile dysfunction? No. A messenger says, the kingdom of God is at hand. Okay. EJ says, you have excellent peripheral vision. Okay. Usurpant says, angry emoji, crying emoji. Okay. The Lord says, hurrah. Okay. SG says, what state do you live in? I am not going to say. Dexo says, tips against erectile dysfunction. Don't grow old. Jordan says, are you sure that you're Hispanic? Yes. South says, pray for Don's ED from jerking off too much. Okay. A messenger says, this a great way to spread the gospel. Ha ha ha. Okay. Mystic says, roughly, how much bleach would I have to consume to gain superpowers? Don't drink bleach. It will hurt you. Legend says, I gotta go eat pizza, bro. Bye, Legend. Enjoy your pizza. John Cena says, Don, OMG, I didn't know you were streaming. Hello, John Cena. Roberta says, I'm back, and nice to see you. Hi, Ro. Brad says, what is the most attractive race? No comment. That ninja says, do Fent. It won't hurt you. I heard it was bad for you, so no. South says, show some emotion, Don. I'm about to finish. You're gonna have to wait. EJ says, I'm going to wake up my wife so she can ask you a question. Babe, wake up. Don is streaming. Vintage says, finish what? I guess he was talking about masturbating. That's my guess. Zombie says, what's your favorite pizza? Just pepperoni pizza. Jordan says, I know you got a juicy little torta. Okay. Patches says, smile, bud. I'll smile when I smile. Luna says, it's anyone else from Egypt? I don't know. Is there anyone else from Egypt in the chat? Unvaxxed says, do you use rope or tape? What? Lover says, cats or dogs? Dogs. Munch says, United Kingdom here? Raising hand emoji. Okay. Louis says, Jeff Buckley. No, he passed away, unfortunately. Kyle says, do you smoke? No. Rose says, bruh, I'm from Kenya. That's cool. Rhea the Rainforest says, me and my crush are dating. I don't know why, but I have a smile stuck in my face. I don't care about anything I just read. It's just stuck there for some reason. Anders says, you ever used the N-word? No. My Honda says, do you believe in Jesus Christ? No, I don't. Jose says he's red. Yeah, I don't know why my face is like having a situation. Mystic says, hey, stop smiling. I'm trying. I don't know why my face is like stuck. Joan says, apostate. Okay. Jim says, your face is fine, bro. Okay. Eliza says, laughing my ass off. People are weird. Yeah, people say weird things. Fading Star says, smile more. Maybe. Tackleland says, smile, smile. Okay. Sharp says, America. Okay. Jose says, Vintage says, I'm illegal. Okay. Okay. Cap or Die says, laughing emoji malfunctioning. Yes. Jordan says, you started smiling soon as N-word mentioned. Yeah, those don't relate. Jay says, why are you upset? I'm not upset. Joan says, who are you looking at when you answer? The camera. South says, can you call ICE on Jose? No. Munch says, what's funny about the N-word? I wasn't laughing about that. Cap says, Don, give me a nickname already. Cap. I like Cap. Cap is good. Luke Wright says, I think Don's smile will be on ABC News. Hopefully just for good things. Jonathan says, Charlie Kirk wannabe eat shit. What? Eliza says, your smile is bright, bro. Thanks. Haktua says, which orange came first or the color? I think the fruit. That Roland Stoner says, laughing emoji. Okay. Aaron says, I'm gay. Okay. Jim says, the fruit, obviously. It's obvious to you? Okay. Hal says, do you game? A little bit. Trentley says, who the fuck is Jeff Buckley? He's a musician. Jordan says, show feet for donations. Hell no. Haktua says, smiley face emoji. Okay. Aaron says, do you play Fortnite once in a blue moon? Louis says, Jeff Buckley is the GOAT singer. Okay. Mystic says, would you rather have a conversation with your past self or future self? Future self. Cap says, who's doing the hoot hoot? What? Haktua says, I'm gay. My brother is gay. My mother is lesbian. My dad is gay. Okay. Ronan says, what's your favorite sport? Basketball. Vintage says, everyone is gay. Okay. Jonathan says, get off your dad's dick, fiddle. What? Jack Will says, shring bang batoon nilly. Okay. Sama says, I'm from India. Hello. Eliza says, to be honest, which comment caught you off guard? It was something I said. Banks Holiday says, have you looked into the transcendental argument for God? I haven't. Maybe I will. Jose says, South, we all gooning to this shit, right? Okay. Haktua says, my mom is kind of homeless. Okay. Munch says, smiley face emoji. Okay. Blue Throttle says, God does not exist, even if he did. No heaven for National Socialist Party? Okay. Aaron says, I'm not actually gay. You were lying before? Okay. Bandito says, this kid's character is starting to crack. I don't know why, but I was getting delirious there. Maybe I'm not hydrating enough. Lambo says, I'm back. Hello, Lambo. Joshua says, I just twisted a bowl and did a fat hot rail bust a fat moco. What? That ninja says, I'm gooning on Paroquet. What? Louis says, what TV are you watching currently? Just YouTube. Dexter says, I ate baked beans and farting a lot. You. Dizzy says, what's your favorite animal? Chimpanzee. Halloween says, if she isn't autistic as fuck, then I'm not feeling. Okay. Ronan says, what's your favorite basketball player? I mean, I don't watch basketball. Connie says, hi from North Carolina. Hi, Connie. Sama says, you look so serious. Okay. Halloween says, LeBron. Okay. Mystic says, who wins in a fight? 1 chimpanzee or 3 apes? 3 apes. Aaron says, I'm not homosexual, I'm homosexual. Cool. Lil Brownie says, this guy is AI. I'm artificial intelligence. Okay. Munch says, do you try to not smile on purpose? I let smiles happen when they happen generally. Haktua says, my mom is kind of homeless. Okay. Cap says, any slumdog millionaires in the building? I don't know. Sarana says, hi from India. India emoji. Hello, Sarana. South says, who wins in a fight? 3 people of a certain race or 1 police officer? What? Luke Wright says, you look like Quentin Tarantino. I don't see it. Vicky says, hi. Hello, Vicky. That ninja says, I let neighbors use my body. Okay. Maga Pepe says, do you have any tips to make my stepfather less attracted to me? Move out. Poppy says, what's up? I'm back, bro. Hello, Poppy. Haktua says, you're light, bro. Yeah, it went out for a second. Sama says, you want to be a billionaire? Why not? Vintage says, lol, that ninja. Okay. Munch says, hi, Don. Hello, Munch. Dexo says, are you as romantic as your eyes look? No. Mystic says, tips on gooning. Don't do it. Jailpro says, hi. Hello, Jailpro. Aaron says, my GF is giving me that Gluck 5000. Okay. Eliza says, what the fuck is wrong with people? Some gay, some beaten meat. What else? No comment. Mello says, I think your head is a smoke detector. Beep. What? Mikey says, please. Please what? Emily says, do you have any degrees or specialized training? No comment. ED says, your voice is putting your face to sleep. Interesting. My own boringness is putting me to sleep. Samuel Jones says, random question. How do I combat chronic loneliness? Play video games with a microphone. Ghost Samra says, Texas has chopped as fuck girls. Okay. MAGA Pepe says, I would join the gooning, but you never said a prayer for my ED. I don't want people to masturbate to this. Jacqueline says, laughing emoji, you're amazing. Heart emoji. Okay. Leon says, do you remember me? I don't. Sorry. Vintage says, WTF. Okay. Jose says, Dom da don, to da ding dong, dang a dong. Okay. Dizzy says, what's your favorite video game? Red Dead Redemption 1. Ghost Samurai says, Bella chopped as fuck. Okay. Luxury says, what do you do for YouTube? Only this. Mikey says, we all need a stretch. Lead us, sir. No. Vicky says, I love Justin Brown. Okay. Sama says, I'm new here. Which type of video do you post on YouTube? Only this. I only do this on YouTube. Luke Wright says, is streaming a part-time job for you? No. MAGA Pepe says, no need for the prayer anymore. My stepfather is here. Okay, sorry to hear that. Eliza says, like I said, people be beaten meat over this. I don't think so. I think people are just saying that to get a rise out of me. Muslima says hello. Hello, Muslima. Haktua says, I'm chopped as fuck, to be honest. Okay. Vintage says, I saw James putting on lipstick. Okay. That Ninja says, I already gooned on opioids last night. Okay. James says, vintage, yeah, and you help me. Okay. DDA says, hi, God bless you all, brothers and sisters. Thanks. Munch says, get a rise out of you, laughing emoji. It's true. Pete Davis says, Jesus is Lord. Okay. Cap or Die says, there's a snake in my boot. Toy Story. Louis says, agnostic. I mean, I don't believe in God. I might be agnostic. Heather says, your smile was beautiful. Thanks. Mello says, how are you today? I'm good, thank you. Aeon says, Dookie Man had pooped. What? Mikey says, talking about beaten meat. I had bad tacos and sharded. Is that normal? From bad tacos, I guess that's normal. Crafts says, I'm from Pakistan. Hello, Crafts. Jitesh says hello. Hello, Jitesh. Louis says, are you on the spectrum or is this a bit? I don't think I'm autistic. James says, vintage is my gay stepbrother stuck in the dishwasher. Okay. Mello says, this is a nice concept. Thank you. Typo says, hello from Poland. Hello, Typo. Aeon says, booty man had done, took a seat. What? Pappy says, hey bro, what are you going to do if the world is full of gays? Do what I'm doing now. Let's Play Football says, I'm back. Hello, Let's Play Football. Louis says, I followed, interested in your content. Okay. Jail Pro says, do you know who's the best in the world? At what? Typo says, this stream feels like a fucked up episode of Black Mirror. Thank you for that comment. That's interesting. Jose says, James Harden and vintage. What? Pete Davis says, I'm learning a lot here. Nice. I am too. Alphone says, is this AI? It's not artificial intelligence. That ninja says, Twilight, okay. Lambo says, bro, is that the same shirt from yesterday? It's the same style as polo shirt. Jail Pro says, I just got back from school. Okay. Yeon says, hello, I'm new to this. What's going on? I'm reading whatever messages you guys send. Pappy says, bro, wearing the same t-shirt. Not the same t-shirt. The t-shirt is different. A-Trees says, maladaptive social reactions here. Okay. Louis says, Tim Robinson fan. I don't know him. Simon says, wake up now. This is all fake. What? Gary says, Baptist O'Hands. Baptist? What? Cap or Die says, can't believe I have been here this long. Maybe you should leave. Benny says, do you sleep during the day? Maybe. Louis says, my picture is my mugshot. That's cool. Someone says, are you Diddy? No. Button says, it's giving Elliot Rodger. Well, I'm not like him. Poppy says, hey bro, what time is it from there? Nighttime. Hey Sokoli says, do you like or hate school? I dislike it. Motivational says, how was the reception at the Diddy's parties? I wasn't there. Mikey says, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. Okay. Munch says, you ignoring me now? Now, Don? I'm not. Spenamo says, if Diddy puts his dick in your ass, you automatically doing the Harlem Shake. Okay. Let's Play Football says, bro was born on the street. Okay. Skate Girl says, do you have a girlfriend? No. Lily says, you're ignoring me, father? Sorry. Rich says, birds aren't real. They are. Jose says, hell yeah, mellow yellow, mellow yellow. Okay. Jar says, how many hours have you been at this? This stream, like an hour and a half. River T says, hi. Hello, River T. Shronda says, y'all stop being rude to this man. I don't mind the rude comments. Motivational Mindset says, just wondering if Diddy did diddle Don Benitez? No. Midnight says, I like Miner. You like guys with pickaxes? Okay. Cap says, Don, would you like to rent a girlfriend? No, I'm not gonna go to Japan and rent a girlfriend. Midnight says yes. Okay. Rich says miners. Yeah, miners, like pickaxes. Jail Pro says, thanks so much, man. Okay, you're welcome. Louis says, what did Diddy do? I heard that he sexually assaulted people. Super says, hey, can I wear you as a hat? No. Gary says, mellow yellow. Dawn is jello. Okay. Andy says, any book recommendations? The Wisdom of Life by Schopenhauer. Maga says, update, my stepfather no longer has ED. Sorry to hear. Steal a Brain Rot says, you've been streaming for a long time. Good job. Thank you. Rich says, laughing emoji. Okay. Jonathan Price says, ice, I-E, ice, 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 and the rain. Okay. Kevin says, she-males are so hot. Would you bang one? No comment. Ima says, go get a life, bro. I'm alive. Poppy says, do you watch anime? Not regularly. Louis says, you have a quiet attractiveness. Thank you. Shazzy says, you sound like Robux. The Roblox currency, I sound like that? Okay. Rain says, any tips starting a channel? If you're gonna stream vertically. You get more viewers that way. Rich says, furries aren't real. They are. Let's Play Football says, you look like you never smile. I smile sometimes. Iana says, I'm back. Sunglasses emoji. Welcome back, Iana. You're a professional I'm back person. Pete Davis says, are you a law student? No. Michi says, yo, WTF. Okay. Benny says, do you have a dad? Everyone does. Andy says, what's the craziest thing you've seen that you can't explain? I don't want to say. Jacqueline says, favorite TV show? Breaking Bad. Mello says, are you happy in life right now? Yes. Hey Sokoley says, why do you hate school? I found it boring. Andy says, I seen a fairy in a gnome. Okay. Luke Wright says, Louis, he must be 22 or 23. Maybe. Yeon says, people are absurd. People in the chat do act absurd. Jose says, mellow yellow. What's good? Fellow says, hello. Eating jello. Nice rhyme. Motivational mindset says, he looks 26. 26? Maybe. Zombie says, what's your favorite anime? It's either Spirited Away or Princess Mononoke. Lily says, what is better, breasts or thighs? I don't have a preference. Glutton says, you better prepare. For what? Benny says, do you take meds? I do. No comment. Lambo says, Jesus loves you. Thank you, but I don't believe in Jesus. It's Ellie YT says, Jesus loves you, as I said. Jazzy says, Don Venti. Brittany Venti. Sam Hyde is here, says, how long have you been a member of the Catholic Boys Choir? I'm not Catholic. Carlito says, you're not human. I'm human. Shaz says, believe in Allah? No. Rich says, Jesus loves Jew. Okay. Kelt says, have you ever met Kevin Spacey? No. Louis says, is this an original idea? As far as I know, I'm the person that invented, like, blah 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 says blah blah blah. Gary says mashed potion soup. Okay. River says F-22. Is that a plane? Lambo says face emoji. Okay. Jose says nah. Told her fa. I said ah. Kaka. What? Jones says bot. I'm not a bot. Carlito says there's no such thing as oxygen either. Okay. Kelt says boxers or briefs. Boxers. BLM says you are not white. Yes. Iana says, do you remember the chimpanzee facts? Yeah, they make nests and they live up to 50 years in the wild. Pete Davis says Toronto Blue Jays or LA Dodgers. Blue Jays. Frozen says you hate mayo because the internet told you to. I don't hate mayo. River says F-35. Is that another plane? Hey Sokoli says how far you have studied. No comment. MS says you look like a cannibal. Okay, MS13. Iana says F-22. Okay. Lambo says 6'7" in a small font. Okay. No Name Goober says $50. I wish that was real. Richard says, are you in school? Maybe. Hey Sokoli says no comments mean tongue out emoji. When I say no comment, it doesn't mean tongue out emoji. Raphael says a bunch of Japanese or Asian text. I mean Chinese or Japanese text. River T says fighter jet it is. Okay. Watchdog says gorilla or chimpanzee. Chimpanzee. James says F. Did the stream die? I don't think it did. Louis says the best burger I've ever had barbecue sauce, and tartar sauce on it. Okay. Jail Pro says, please answer, do you remember the old memes? Do you know the way? Is that one? MS says, do you like mathematics? No. Poppy says, why the fuck people say this is AI? Because I have a very systematic way of, like, reading chat, you know? River says F-47. Okay. Rich says, it's AI. Okay. Iana says, dude, why don't you believe in religion? Because I just, I just don't. Luke Wright says, I don't like maths either, Don. Okay. Fosia says, quintessential. Okay. Louis says, Nathan Fielder. I don't know who that is. Lily says, I want to know what love is. Okay. Hyun says, this might be a social experiment. Yeah, I kind of think this stream is, like, in a way, a social experiment. Rich says, do you believe in a soul? No. Watchdog says, why do you like chimps more than gorillas? It's just based off of feeling, you know? I don't have, like, a specific reason. Kelt says, Bueller. Okay. What? River T says, okay. Poppy says, favorite subject in school, bro? History. 420 Ladybug says, go Blue Jays, go. Okay. Rich says, most people who don't have a religion don't believe in souls. Yeah, that's true. Poppy says, favorite subject in school, bro? I already said history. Dixie says, what's your favorite type of music? Rock. Munch says, I don't have a religion, but I believe in souls. That is unusual. 420 says peace and love. Bye, 420. He Eon says, let me guess your ethnicity. No racism. Hispanic. Yes. Frankie says, just found out the woman I've been dating is in a cult. I mean, I don't, okay. Carlito says, school did not teach you history. You think they told fake history? MS says, I like you. You're my type of person. Weren't you hating on me like a second ago? Did I win you? Iana says, Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Jesus Christ who strengthens me. Okay. Kelt says, like his last name isn't a hint. Yeah, it is a... I see what you're saying. Lambo says, don't you have a soul? I just don't believe in souls. Lambo says, don't you have a soul? I don't believe in souls. Katrina says, I can't with this anymore. What the fuck is happening? Chaos. Pete Davis says, favorite Canadian place? Vancouver. Nothing to subscribe to says, people aren't real. I think they are. Gluton says, you better. I feel good right now. Shazil says, Jesus is not God. Okay. Iana says, how do you think people were made? Sperm and an egg. Zapimba says, I poop my pants. Okay. Jailpro says, answer please. Nowadays kids just play Roblox, man. I don't know your question. Heon says, I swear, people enforce religion. It's a bit. You don't like how forceful people are with it? Okay. Nothing to subscribe to says, don't you love genitals? No. I mean, I appreciate that I have my own. Louis says, do you want me to leave? If you should leave and you have better things to do, you should. Amy says, a blue heart emoji. Okay. Iana says, no, like at the beginning of the earth. How were humans made? I believe in Darwin's theory. Res says, do you have a tattoo? I don't. Zapimba says, should I clean myself? If you're covered in feces like I think you said earlier, you should. Jailpro says, hey Don, do you think I'm gay? I have no idea. Heon says, what are your thoughts on paganism? I don't know enough about it. Hey Sokoli says, tongue out emoji. Okay. Lily says, the universe always existed. Interesting. Peter Cooper says, a male gorilla's penis is only 2 inches long on average. I thought it would be longer. MS says, what is your favorite event in history? Civil War. Beef says, are you gay? No. Fauzia says, clouds are puffy white and misty moist. Okay. Katrina says, what did I walk in on? Chaos. Something like Hurricane Katrina. Peter Cooper says, no, Google it. It's 2 inches. Wow. Pete Davis says, Zeppelin, Foo Fighters, or Nickelback? Zeppelin. Simon says, do you get sexual gratification from the fear in your victim's eyes? I don't sexually assault people. Rich says, what event started the Civil War? Well, in the history books, it says slavery. Shazil says, the fuck, is this AI? No. Katrina says, collective dumbness. Partly. Skate Girl says, who is your favorite general or leader? Stonewall Jackson. Carlito says, history is a lie. Okay. Ghost Samurai says, violence turns me on. You're a sadist. Okay. Celt says, uh, assignation of Archduke Ferdinand. Assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Okay. 3D says Star Trek or Star Wars. Star Wars. Shazil says, do you watch One Piece? I don't. Rich says, Lincoln believed only smart blacks should be able to vote, laughing out loud. He believed that? Carlito says, we have never been to the moon. Okay. Beef Tempura says, why are you still awake? Because I'm a night owl. Lily says, Iana, the theory of evolution includes the animals from very basic life to human. Okay. Lily says, Lincoln based. Okay. Joan says, what state are you in? I'm gonna keep that private. Jack says, which year was your favorite? 2020. Oh, like Civil War, 1861. Andy says, you would like Iron John? Look up what it's about. Maybe. Gluton says, I'm walking to your location right now. Please don't kill me. Heon says, which is better, expressing or restraining hormonal reactions? I'm not sure what that means. Typo says, I'd rather guard opened Hennessy in the hood with only a stick as a weapon than put myself through what you do. This isn't hard. Beef says, you live in Utah 'cause you look Mormon. It's the polo shirt, isn't it? Ghost Samurai says, 2020 was GOAT. I had COVID parties and drove around Atlanta in an ambulance at night. Interesting. Amy says, are you a narcissist? Possibly. Peter Cooper says, are you Gavin Newsom's son? No. Ashfax says, are you white? No. Katrina says, oh wait, are you a comedian? No. Mason says, skull with bones emoji. Hi, I don't know. Hi, Mason. Spamano says, why are you doing this? For fun. Jail Pro says, hey Don, do you remember me? Yes, you spam the chat like an annoying person. Pappy says something, I can't read it because the lighting is messed up. He says, favorite movie, bro? Eyes wide shut. 3D says, A1 steak sauce was created during the Civil War. I did not know that. Thanks for the fact. Pap says, where are you from? North America. Zapimba says, what's your favorite alien from Ben 10? I didn't watch Ben 10 growing up. Richard says, why light keep turning off? It's my computer monitor. I need to touch the mouse every once in a while for it to like not turn off. I keep on forgetting to like move the mouse. Russell says it's the tight. What? MS says he's a hikikomori, a hermit. No. Carlito says, how is evolution real if there's still monkeys? I don't know. Just a Girl says, Sue sell seashell by the seashore. Okay. Luke says, do you like Coldplay? Somewhat. Jose says, Katrina says, what did I walk into chaos like Hurricane Katrina? Yeah, I said that earlier. 3D says, there are no muscles in human fingers. Wow. Yeon says, which sin is the worst in your opinion? The violent kinds. What's that called? Wrath. Poppy says, what games do you play? Minecraft. Chips says, hi Don. Hello, Chips. Wayno says, is it true you can't see your reflection in mirrors? I can. 3D says, the muscles in your palms move your fingers. Thanks for making my streaming experience not just brain rot, but like educational. Zapimba says, have you played Elden Ring? I haven't. Luke Wright says, for me, the worst sin is neighbors. What? Jail Pro says, I'm not annoying, Don. You're making me feel bad. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel bad. Hisa says, what age did you find out Santa wasn't real? I never believed in Santa. Carlito says, I can show anyone how to interact with sky orbs. What? Poppy says, whoa, Minecraft? You know Dream and Technoblade? Yeah, I know of them both. Katrina says, how are you able to do this with a straight face? I guess I'm used to it. Richard says, bye, gotta go. Bye, Richard. Zapimba says, CJ killed a lot of people in my gameplay. When you play San Andreas, you kill a lot of people? Okay. Wrestle says, is that butt right? What? Relatable says, do you like men? No, not sexually. Musa says, please give a shout out to my friend Hugh Janus. You wanted me to say huge anus. There you go. Hisa says, have you ever cried? Yes. Kelt says, ever heard of the comedian Stephen Wright? I haven't. Jamie says, if you were offered a spot on Mars as a pioneer, would you take it? I would not. Musa says, how many donuts if one donut is equal to 1 inch? What? Silent Treatment says, what tribe are you from? If I have, like, tribes in my heritage, I don't know which tribes. Real Legacy says, are you happy? Yes, I am happy. Billy the Jit says, do you listen to Yellow Days? I don't. Rich says, fun fact, the income tax was started by Lincoln as a temporary tax to help fund the Civil War. This was 1861. Interesting. Jail Pro says, thanks, Don, and sorry if I did make you angry. It's no problem. I was exaggerating earlier. Spamano says, would you rather do Kim Kardashian body with Kanye head or Kanye blah, blah, blah? I would have Kanye's body and Kim's head. Chip says, sorry if your eyes hurt. Thank you. Poppy says, bro is using one eye mode. Yeah, I was. Musa says, please give a shout out to my friend Dixon Myers. You wanted me to say Dix my ass. There you go. Ha ha ha. Billy Legit says, wear some sunglasses, bro. I mean, you wouldn't be able to see my eyes, which I think it's important. You see my eyes. Silent Treatment says, are you okay? Yes. I think my eyes were just getting irritated by the screen. Jose says, Katrina says, how are you able to do this with a straight face? Yeah, Katrina said that earlier. Hisa says, are you happy mentally? Yes. Real says, how long have you been live roughly? 2 hours. Kelt says blink twice if you need help. I'm fine. Rich says hydrate. Yeah, I'll be doing that soon. Jail Pro says, Don, I'm from Sarajevo. Okay. Cotton Candy Bear says, or maybe it's the contacts, the eye contacts, maybe. Musa says, bro finally lost his character. Okay. Poppy says, dildo, the sex toy. Okay. Amy says, you are skipping, laughing emoji. Okay. Jose says, Don, I'm from Daddy's Balls. Okay. Rich says, primed his water bottle. Yes, I did. Jail Pro says, do you need help, Don? No. Musa says, you Amba Taka, I don't know what that means. Amy says, unamused emoji. Okay. Zapimba says, what did you have for breakfast? I didn't, I don't remember. Jose says, Poppy says dildo like the sex toy. Okay. MS says picky eater. Okay. Swedish Pizza says, bro's skipping me. Fuck did I do? Are you saying something vulgar? Maybe YouTube is censoring you. Silent Treatment says, do you feel like you're the only one conscious and everyone else is just fake? No. MS says, it's okay, we love you. Thanks. Amy for Life says, hi, remember me? I asked what your favorite sport was in your last stream. I'm sorry, I don't remember you. Mikey Money says, are you doing No Nut November? I don't care for No Nut November. Silent Treatment says, be safe, man. Thanks. 3D says, chainsaws were invented to help women during childbirth. Yeah, I know, that's crazy, isn't it? Rob Bell says, you must be the life at the party. Okay. Musa says, Morningwood. Okay. Pappy says, do you watch Toy Story, bro? I've watched the Toy Story movies. Katrina says, oh, so Jose just repeats shit he already said. Okay. Afghan says, what are you doing? Reading chat. Relatable says, please shout out my friends Henry and Harvey. Good luck to them. Zapimba says, are you currently using an anal plug? No. Jim says, Sierra Le Marbell. Okay. Little Z Gamer says, why does it look like you're being held hostage? I'm not. Rich says, broke the system. Ahmed says, what's you doing on that watch? Don't worry about it. Jail Pro says, thank you, Don. I'm getting happier, Don. Okay. Musa says, would you please eat our infested curry? No. Amy says, laughing emoji. Okay. Afghan says, you're annoying. Okay. Silent Treatment says, are you a time traveler? No. Rich says, Don's a low-key genius. I don't think so. Aisha says, hey. Hello, Aisha. BJ says, I still need more cowbell. Okay. Junebug says, just wanted to let you know you're very handsome. Thank you. 3D says, McDonald's once created bubblegum flavored broccoli. That's crazy. Musa says, are you a small hatter? No. Real says, everyone double tap that screen if you want to. M says, did your bottom teeth eat your top teeth? Do I have like an underbite or overbite or something? Rob Bell says, are you wearing a turtleneck? No, it's a polo shirt. Amy says, don't skip that question. Unamused emoji. What? Jose says, Katrina call you out, bro Tato. Okay. Zapimba says, do you feel empathy for me? No. Musa says, are you Nigerian? No. Rich says, when's the best time to wear a striped sweater? I don't know. Rob Bell says, do you speak Spanish? Do I speak Spanish? No. Jonathan says, you are a predator, fucking sick bastard. No, I'm not. MS says he doesn't like stripes. I don't. Musa says, would you duck my sick? No. Zapimba says, do you wear swim trunks when you go to the beach? Yes. Master Pilot says, what hair dye do you use? I don't use hair dye. Lunzi says, my balls are sore. Sorry to hear. Rob Bell says, would you consider wearing a thong? No. 3D says, what the fuck? Lol, internet people are weird as fuck. Okay. Jonathan says, you got dick lips? Okay. JMP says, what age are you? Not gonna say. I am an adult though. JL Pro says, my balls hair is sweaty right now, Don. Okay. DJ says, have a fantastic day. You too, DJ. Master Pilot says, I think the pink eye is better. Good. Awesome. B Bob says, bro, you're still live? Yes. Bendy says, what's your favorite dog breed? Border Collie. The football fan says, I like men. Okay. Aisha says, how are you? Good. Thank you, Aisha. Jail Pro says, hey Don. YouTube play button emoji. Okay. Dr. Hard ASMR says, are you a sussy baka? No. Musa says, are you Big Chungus? No. 3D says, internet trolling is a legitimate psychological hang-up deeply rooted in self-esteem and abandonment issues. Maybe I have that because I've trolled on the internet quite a bit. Jail Pro says, can I ask you something, Don? Sure. Jose says, Connor, why are you spamming mud fusta brosta? What? BLM says, get back to the reservation, you dirty person. What? Poppy says, I laugh so hard that I need to goon. Weird. Pappy says, I already read that. Mitzian says, believe it or not, your corpse stiffens within 4 days. Wow, I did not know that. I'm gonna end the stream now. Bye.